Good afternoon. Welcome to our afternoon message on Sunday. Today we are starting a three lesson series on tough questions. And tough questions are, well, as the title suggests, tough. We're going to be dealing with some interesting, thorny issues. And, going through tough questions is really important for three reasons. One is it helps us stay open-minded to particular questions or concerns or even perceptions of what the Bible says or teaches, or what Christians believe, or how they're supposed to behave, things like that. And sometimes there are things that we've ignored because we've been focused on maybe just our textual knowledge of Scripture. But there are a lot of questions that emerge that don't always lend themselves to a textual study. The second thing is, questions like this, or tough questions, keep us honest. They keep us honest because they make us wrestle with tough issues and verses that don't always make sense, and thorny faith problems. And sometimes it helps us realize that even with the Bible, we don't always have every possible answer to every possible question or issue. So it helps us still live and walk by faith and not by sight, and helps us wrestle with, the things that we don't know or maybe not have a definitive answer on. You know, um, the third thing is, it is part of our responsibility as people of God to provide an answer to questions, for the hope. Why do we have hope in the Bible, in Jesus, in God? Why do we have hope in the gospel? So those three reasons, I believe, help us um, explain why a series like this is important. Another thing is, I want to brace you. We'll probably spend a little extra more time than maybe our other videos, because tough questions demand a little extra time. I'm not going to hopefully go too extra long, but in these uh, we will spend some time together. So get comfy, because here we go. Our tough question today is focused on the question: did God command genocide in the Old Testament against the Canaanites? Frankly, that's a really, really thorny question. It's probably one of the most common criticisms on the moral level against God that is often raised. And so today I thought we would address that as best as we can with the time that we have. Believers, skeptics, agnostics, atheists, or the new atheists, which is a branch of atheism that is a militant movement that is bent on affirming that religion has and is the reason for all the ills of society. Um, but they do raise this question. Now, for us Bible believers, it sometimes is a hard question to wrestle with. So we're going to look at that, because it does ask us to raise questions about our God, and the dichotomy sometimes, or the false choice of, is the God of Jesus and the God of the Old Testament different? I don't believe that. I believe they're the exact same God. But that is something that's sometimes brought up, that the God of the Old Testament, angry and all this other stuff, and Jesus is all about love and peace, and he's the cool guy Jesus. Um, I don't believe that the Old Testament, New Testament God is different. What we do see, and that may be some question we tackle down the road, is a different emphasis of our relationship with God. But a misunderstanding of this is quite common, of this particular topic about genocide and the Canaanites. Back in 2017, in the Independent, uh, they have it on their website. Um, an article appeared by Ian Johnson entitled "Bible Says Canaanites Were Wiped Out by Israelites, but Scientists Just Found Out Their Descendants Living in Lebanon." Now, what does that imply? What does the title, that lengthy title, imply? The Bible declared that the Canaanites were destroyed, and through this genocidal act. Um, but guess what? They survived because their DNA is found in people today in Lebanon. When I first read that title, I was like, I'm not surprised that the Canaanites were, DNA was found in modern people in Lebanon. They were never ultimately destroyed. They were never God never called Israel to completely and utterly destroy every single Canaanite that ever existed. This is not genocide. This is not like Nazi Germany, where the system was to eradicate every possible Jew that exists. And I'm gonna make some points about that later. But even with a few handpicked and handcrafted quotations from the Old Testament, still, the article presumed that God's program for the war, like in the book of Joshua, was a complete genocidal attack on the Canaanites. And that's not true. We'll get into that. It's just a misunderstanding of the story. Now, another issue that we'll just note here, and it will play into at least some of our preliminary stuff, is that in this moral charge against God and his nature, it's often very common for God to be attacked here, for even thinking of attacking or sending the Israelites into war against the Canaanites. Here's one known, infamous atheist, part of the new atheist movement, Richard Dawkins, back in 2006. So this book's good 15 years old. He said this in The God Delusion: "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction." Did you catch that? Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Well, tell me how you really feel, Richard Dawkins. So, in this moral charge against God, right? He's a bully. He's so selfish and so into himself, and he hates every other nation and race. He's genocidal. It really paints a really daunting picture. This is so that the issue is one that it's a tall order, and it's one that I'm fully aware of the challenges, and it's a very complex issue. What I want to tell you today is I'm not going to be able to address everything. It would take lots of videos, lots of discussion, going through so many arguments and counter arguments. But I will address and at least offer 3 lines of thought. So that these are the 3 goals of my lesson. The first one is we have to appreciate the context of what is happening in the story. God is revealing himself in the ancient Near East, in the Mediterranean world, and in this era, part of one of the ways in which sort of your God showed dominance and power was through war. And it would reveal that your God was more powerful than the other gods. And the distinction here, though, is in Israel's case, God is showing that he is the only God. Not that he is more powerful, but that he is the only God in the heavens. That in the heavenly realm, there's only him as the true God, the ultimate divine one. And it's through him that the heavens were created. And so this goes and reinforces, the worldview of Israel, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. And the other gods don't exist. They're not real. So he's going to show his greatness over the Canaanite deities. The second thing I want to point out is in this sort of warring section of Scripture, part of the warring is not just bloodshed and I suggest as if that's part of it. No, it is not about bloodlust. like Canaanite deities, they had a lot of bloodlust. They would bathe in the blood of their enemies and all that. Instead, this was designed to root out pagan religions and their atrocious or their atrocities, or their, as I would argue, their crimes against humanity. And we'll get into that as well. Some of it being child sacrifice, infant child sacrifice, and other things. But it was designed to root out these pagan religions, their culture and influence, and drive them out. Which goes into my third point, is that Israel, the plan that Israel was given, is framed in strong language, but when you begin to see a broader picture from the Bible itself, you realize that there were guidelines to restrain Israel from going to that level of genocide. They were not called to genocide. They were actually given many rules to restrain themselves in going to battle with these countries, with these nations, these cultures. And so we're going to argue, and we do argue here, that the war was never supposed to be a genocide. So the entire language of how this is portrayed is really bent to already make you prejudicial against the issues that the Bible is telling the story for. So let's get into some of that. But before we do, before we get into my 3 points, I want to deal with the moral nature of this particular lesson. I guess we could always go to this sort of presupposition on any topic, but the moral outrage by people like atheists, like Richard Dawkins, like in the quote, or others, really sort of begs the question on morality on their end of the table. And from an atheistic vantage point, that worldview really isn't structured to offer absolute moral statements. It's only really capable of offering subjective concerns of right and wrong. And you may only at a broad level get into a social contract of everyone, we're all going to agree, though we don't have a moral standard, we're all going to agree for the time being that this is right. Maybe down the road we'll change our minds, but this sort of social contract is as big as you can get. The problem, though, is in the end, it's all just a self-defeating subjective concern. In other words, because I don't have an external standard to point to this, your conduct is wrong because of this moral standard, I'd argue then that you're just left with your personal opinion. I don't know that it's absolutely wrong from this vantage point. I just know I think it's wrong. Well, guess what? You know what the response to that is? Well, I just think you're wrong. Now prove me wrong. And we get into this sort of circular subjective situation. That's why things like the argument that if there's one absolute truth, that there is no absolute morality or absolute truth, becomes a self-contradictory statement. Because guess what? In order to make a claim that there is no absolute truth or absolute morality, you just made an absolute statement. And so you end up in a circular problem. And that's something to seriously consider. And I think it's really important that when our friends who are poking at our text or our faith, they want to make moral claims, they really have to address that. Why do they have the ability to make a moral standard that I'm supposed to submit to when there really is no basis in their worldview for that? In the end, like Timothy Keller, who's a New York preacher, and he points out this: it's not that atheists have no absolute morals. They do. It is that they just have no basis for having them. So that is fundamentally what's problematic here. We have moral standards, and we act as if they're absolute, but from that vantage point, you really have no basis for them. So one new atheist Sam Harris argued that you can only derive your morals from the scientific method. Well, guess what? The problem with that is, again, is scientific methods come with assumptions, and those assumptions change, and that affects oftentimes how you evaluate things. And ultimately, science and the scientific method can only tell you what is, not what ought to be or what ought not to be. Science can only tell you the habits and behaviors and the regularities of nature. It can't tell you how you're supposed to behave and how you're not supposed to behave. So there's a problem there. There's a leap there. In the end, the real question I think we're facing is that what's supposed to be done when there is an unjust society, and the Canaanites fit into that category? Do you let them just continue to be unjust and do crimes against humanity, or would it be fair to stop them? And I think ultimately that's what we're facing here is in the text. There is other secondary passages in the Bible that show that God has been very patient with the Canaanites. And at this point, that patience and that threshold has terminated. At the base of their religion were the gods of the Canaanites. And many of these Canaanite cities had local deities. And as with other nations of the ancient Near East, these religions were, they were syncretistic. In other words, they had multiple religions that they would merge, and they would share these gods. Part of that was the Canaanite cult involved female and male prostitution, as well as human sacrifice. And so you end up with a culture of adultery, temple adultery. You end up with bestiality. You end up with homosexual acts, largely connected to the temple behavior. And also child sacrifice was permitted. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 20 to 30, this moral issue, right? Not like doctrine, right? But moral issues is really at the heart of the concern that God has for the Israelites. In Leviticus 18 says this, verse 20, and you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, which is a Canaanite god, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And you shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. This is all, again, connected to the Canaanite practices and their rituals. Do not make yourself unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. So that's a key phrase, I am driving out. That'll come up later. And the Lord became unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So this metaphor of because of their wickedness and these crimes, some of these crimes against humanity, like the children and immorality, sexual immorality, God is saying the land has become polluted, the land has become unclean, and metaphorically it is pushing them out, or God is basically the instrument of that. But here's the contrast, you shall keep my statutes and my rules and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. ... So keep my charge, verse 30, never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourself unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. So God's concern is this moral purity and the contamination that would come from these nations if Israel did not have strong values and did not allow themselves to be polluted by them and contaminated by practicing them. And so God is wanting them to be proactive, but also they end up functioning as his instrument of justice against them. So it has been argued, just as another reminder, that the Canaanite and Phoenicians practices, so it became a widespread phenomenon, in particular child sacrifices. It's known to have reached as far as North Africa and Carthage. For example, a 4th century BC Greek writer by the name of Cleitarchus writes this, and this is a summary from another writer. Out of the reference for Kronos, the Greek equivalent of Baal Hammon, the Phoenicians and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice for the deity if they are especially eager to gain success. So it is, and that's just a sample. It is an issue. It is a problem that has emerged, and it is one that is something to be dealt with. The killing of born children in our society and day and age, we are killing yet to be born children. Yet Canaanites were doing this to their living children. So what is fascinating to me at this point in the question of morality is that God delayed judgment. Way back in Genesis 15, verse 16, there's a little interesting note that God is saying that the sins of the Amorites or the Canaanites, Canaanite faction, had not yet reached its full threshold. And this would be a good another, over 400 years later, than which the Canaanites would finally receive any kind of act by God through the Israelites. So I want to make something clear. I'm not making the claim or the case that the Canaanites were the worst people ever, and I'm not making the case or the claim that that they were the worst behaved people, they had the worst religion ever. I am making the case, though, or assuming the case at this point, that their sins from their culture had reached a tipping point in which God was now going to double up both the blessing and promise of a land to Israel, would also serve as an opportunity to punish the Canaanites for their atrocious crimes against humanity, religious practices, and sexual immorality, or all the different influences that came with it. So I think that is an important point to make. God is the one who is the judge of all, and an entire culture is now doing some pretty messed up things. All right, so my first argument, that God was revealing his greatness over the Canaanite deities in war, as it challenged their existence and their power. So the first thing to consider is remember that in the Bible, God's earthly actions are reflecting a heavenly reality, a cosmic reality. So what God does on earth reflects something real about the cosmic eternal plane. His authority is because in heaven, he is authority. Everything is done by him, through him, because of him. Existence is here because of him. So idolatry, then, as an example, may seem harmless. What's wrong with statues and bowing to statues and all of that stuff? But at the spiritual level, they reflect an earthly oppression of a false deity and an earthly rebellion by us rejecting the true deity. Therefore, so when we read in Exodus, God, through the plagues, is not just bringing some, wrath and smiting on the Egyptians. He is, in fact, making an argument that they may know that the Lord is God. These plagues are a basic battle showing that God is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. One God is greater than all of these 10 gods, if at minimum. It's a cosmic battle that's happening on earth. If you want to look at the passage, that they may know that the Lord is God, Exodus 6:7, 7:5, 7:17, 8:22, 8:2, 14:4, 14:18, just as an example. And this becomes even clearer as you keep reading the biblical story in the book of Joshua, which is, after the Exodus and after the 40 years of wandering. You get a very interesting picture of Rahab in in Jericho. And she says this in Joshua chapter 2, verse 9 to 11. She said to these men, the spies that had come to see her, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the fear of you and that the fear of the Lord has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction, which is a phrase used for destroying pagan cultic things. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, catch it, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. So Rahab is articulating the impact of what God did in Egypt, what God did, during the wandering, the 40 years of wandering, and how it created a theological or cosmic battle where they could perceive who is the real God, and that the God of Israel is greater than all gods. And the amazing leap is God of heaven and on earth. So this is the bigger picture at the heart of these stories that we're looking at, is that it's not just warfare, human conflict, and God is going, haha, I love it when my people fight. He is presenting himself to the world, and he is using Israel as the revelation that in them they are being introduced to the true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Israelites, the God of Moses, the God of Joshua. And Egypt knows, the Canaanites know, and now this God is, a real player in the Mediterranean world, to use maybe modern language. Okay, my second argument here is this. God commanded Israel to root out the influence of the Canaanite pagan institutions. So I've been saying this, and a lot of what I'm saying here is interconnected. So excuse me for, seeming like I'm begging for the argument for these, but they are all interconnected. But one of the issues involved here is this: who gave Israel the right to war against and to displace the Canaanites from their lands? Right? Who gave them that right? I mean, it is a fair question. It's a fair question. Maybe not the most comfortable one for people of faith, but it is a fair question. Why did Israel get to do that? If all of a sudden we just said, hey, Mexico, we're going to just run you over, and we're going to take your land, and you need to figure out where you're going to live. No one would really like that. People would think that they would add another reason why they would think Americans are crazy and immoral. So there's this Israeli psychologist, and this comes from Paul Copan's book, who raises this question in this way: we rightly condemn the killing of an ethnic group when carried out by Nazis or Hutus. But Israel seems to get a pass, indeed, a divine order, when doing the same thing to the Canaanites! Exclamation point. So in other words, on the surface, what the Nazis did with with Hitler and all that to the Jews, on the surface, what Joshua did with the Canaanites, they don't really look very different. Now let this soak in. What makes the difference? Religious values? Well, for Nazi Germany, that was part of the German church theology. I mean, the German church was behind him. So it's not that it was, theology necessarily. What you have here is a question of what gave them the right. And this is true. We would question that today. We would question the genocides in the continent of Africa, right? And we do. In fact, regarding the Nazis and the Nuremberg trials, regarding the war crimes of Nazi Germany, it was argued that such genocidal behaviors violated a higher law of human morality that was not subject to provincial claims. In other words, Germany didn't violate any German laws. These were the laws in the books. They couldn't violate American laws because Germany wasn't subject to American law. but they did something so atrocious. They did such crimes against humanity that it superseded provincial laws and violated a higher morality that we're all accountable to. And that on that basis, they were able to try them. So what gives here? I think it's a fair question. I'm going to suggest 2 points that might help alleviate some of the tension. As I've said, I can't provide everything here in this brief time, but here's 2 things I'd say. God provided Israel with the why. God provided Israel with why they could attack the Canaanites and displace them. And part of that is the immoral practices of the Canaanites. On the one hand, yes, they were promised the land. So the land, from the Bible's perspective, was deeded to them, though not given to them, very early on in their history. But as a supplemental issue regarding the war against the Canaanites, God provided the why. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 18, we read this: "But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your gods." Now, in context, this is dealing with the particular cities that did not accept the terms of peace that we'll talk about later, that shows that Israel was not just going in there blunt force trauma, but they offered cities an opportunity to come to terms of peace, and part of that was to reject Canaanite religions. And for those that didn't, then they were called then to bring this judgment on these cities. But I want to point out again, they were told why they're able to do this, because of the religious practices, the abominable practices, these immoral practices, child sacrifice, temple sexual behavior, immorality, idolatry, very significant immoral practices from a biblical point of view. And so, as shown in Leviticus 18:20 to 30, as we've already looked at, the Israelites were well aware of the immoral practices of the Canaanites. So they knew why that God had called them to do that. They were evil. They were doing evil things. The second thing is, God provided Israel with the when to the judgment act, to this act of judgment. Now, this kind of needs a little background. The Bible reveals God as one who does not think like we do, humans. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Isaiah 55, 8-9. Now, part of that is an argument that we will not make choices the way God makes choices. We will not practice wisdom the way God uses wisdom. And some of what we think to be wise and pragmatic is actually sinful and foolish. So it's really important that we appreciate that point. The Bible reveals a God who will at times provide his insights to his people. In 1 Corinthians 2:10-13, "These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual." So 1 Corinthians chapter 2 then shows us that God does reveal himself and reveal his thoughts. Maybe not everything, but he does often tell us what's on his mind, why he wants us to do things. He often does tell us what the purpose is, or where our goals are, or what's on the horizon. And in particular, Paul in Acts 17 tells us that God is often involved in human affairs and human governments. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. But did you catch that? In verse 26, he made from one man every nation of mankind. So every human being is made by God, part of the result of God's creative order and creation. And he's involved not just in their boundaries of their nations, but apparently their allotted periods of dominance and rise and fall. He's involved. And so it is this God who is involved, created everything, knows everything, has wisdom that is different from ours or higher than ours, thinking processes that are holy and eternal in their depth and breadth. And this is the God who employed Israel to be his vehicle of justice against the Canaanites, to remove these practices from the land where Israel would be living. And it also showed his dominance over these false gods, that they are not real, they do not exist. Finally, my third argument here. God's command regarding the war, or holy war, as we get so common to describe, had many principles that would restrain Israel from actual genocide. So, yes, there are passages, go and utterly kill everything that breathes. We read a passage just like that. But we also have to be balanced and realize ancient methods of exaggeration to suppress a point. That's a legitimate linguistic reality that we have to take into account. I don't have time to get into that right now, but it is something to think about. But we also have to appreciate that there are other passages that supplement these sort of war passages, and they show us some other things. For example, the practical purposes of these wars was to drive out the Canaanites out from the region that God had promised Israel's forefathers. Look at this, Exodus 23, 27 to 33. This is, I think, the first time God spells out everything here. I will send my terror before you, and I will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Now, a couple important points. I will drive them out. They will be driven out. This is the idea of pushing people out. This is the language of displacement. God is telling them the primary role that you have in warring against these people is to push them out, and that you may, take the land and that it may be yours as a possession. Now, there might be some other moral questions you have on that issue, and I would understand. But at this point, I just want to make the case that it was not go and gut every single thing you see that's a Canaanite. It was drive them out. That's the primary method that they were supposed to use. So peace treaties come into play. In fact, here's in Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 to 18. Listen to this. Peace treaty, terms of peace. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. But the women and the little ones, the livestock and everything else in the city, all of its spoil, you shall take as plunder for yourself. You shall enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall go, thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here, but in the cities of these people, that the Lord your God has given you for an inheritance. You shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Now, some of this we've already read, but this is language of peace treaties. Now, they're very different peace treaties than how we might write them today. We have to appreciate them in their ancient context. All right, it's really important that we appreciate them in their ancient context. That they offered up peace, terms of peace, and if the city says no, we're not going to take your terms of peace, we're going to fight you. Israel was then permitted to besiege the city, and then besiege them, conquer them, destroy the city, and devote things to destruction, which is language that is a reference to the destruction of pagan temples and high places and altars and things that are connected to it. So it's important to realize it wasn't just run into those cities and blow things up. It was, we are here from the God of Israel, and you can be a part of what God is doing, and if not, and if they attack you, you can respond. All right. Deuteronomy 21, 10-14 also shows us something that I find pretty interesting. Israelite warriors were allowed and permitted to marry Canaanites. So much for sometimes the criticism that they wanted to genocide everyone. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your right hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So this is a very interesting case, because here is the argument of God saying, look, if you go into these cities and in the midst of all this war, you come in contact with a woman, and somehow you strike up a conversation and you want to marry her, you can bring her home and go through this process of and letting her leave her family and leave her culture. And if it doesn't work out on her end, you let her go, and you don't do anything to her. You don't hurt her. You let her go. You don't sell her. Nothing. You treat her with respect, because this language of you humiliated her, it has to do with sexual connotation in the ancient world, and so there was a unfortunate cultural reaction in the ancient world for those that had been sexual and divorced or put away or something like that. So, but my point here is, they were given a lot of guidelines, and there are things that shows restraint and interaction. You can marry them. You can give them peace. You can incorporate them into the kingdom. Things like that. And finally, the Canaanites were not destroyed. The Philistines are a Canaanite ethnicity or culture, society, and you see them throughout the Old Testament story. Samson, in the period of the Judges, constantly is fighting against the Philistines. One of David's mighty men, mighty warriors, was a Canaanite, a Hittite, Uriah. 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, and he's listed among his great warriors in chapter 23, verse 39. Uriah is the husband of Bathsheba that David sleeps with and gets her pregnant, and then kills Uriah to cover it up. And David frequently, in his early years, and even later would find himself in refuge among the Philistines. So, the Canaanites did not go away. They were neighboring countries. And so this is maybe secondary evidence, but Israel was not required to kill everyone, destroy every possible Canaanite. What we see in the Bible is a story of God showing his dominance in the ancient world through the language of war, which was the coinage of the realm. It was how you showed that you were loyal to a powerful God, that he warred on your behalf. And God fights against Israel. The Bible is full of passages where the Old Testament God is a warrior who fights for Israel. And he promises that as they fight, he is with them fighting, and that they should not fear. And this was, again, to create an understanding in the ancient world that the God of Israel is not just a powerful God, but the only God. And Rahab is a great example of the consequence of that. But the other reason is to show that there were other purposes besides war. And one of them had to do with rooting out the crimes against humanity of the Canaanite practices of killing little children, sacrificing up to their gods so that they can have corn or they can have wheat in their fields, and the various other immoral practices connected to it, so that it did not affect the Israelites who were moving into the area and taking the land over. Which brings me to my third point. Even in the midst of war, the Israelites were given strong restraint rules that gave them restraint, allowed them to offer peace, allowed them to marry women and be involved, and to take them into their culture and take them into their society, and actually make them participants in Israel and the things that they're doing. So I think these 3 points could be very helpful in at least calming some of the questions here. And I hope that as we conclude today, that you appreciate at least some of these things. Now, I have not answered every question that could be, not even some of the questions that may have come up as I was giving this material to you, but I hope and pray if you do have questions, feel free to Facebook us, YouTube message us, however you want to reach out to us. We'll do our best to help talk through this. And hey, maybe these are not satisfactory for you. I understand. It's a big issue. It's complicated. And we bring a lot of questions to things and a lot of assumptions about things. So please, if we can help you, let us know. Thank you so much. God bless you. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thank you so much for watching our videos and content. If you want more videos, more content, and want to know more about us, visit our website or subscribe to us on YouTube and like us on Facebook. We'll see you next time.